change your world. It's time to let it go. The things you used to think, the things you used to know, they don't help you anymore. It's time to change your mind. If it's peace you want to find.
This is Kurt Kaikonen, pastor of Calvary Chapel, Waterford, at your neighborhood church. Today on Change Your World, we'll be in the book of Exodus. So grab your Bible and let's get started.
It's time to change your world. You need to let it go. Oh, oh.
So everywhere they went, all the people around them, they would be seeing this huge pillar coming. So it wouldn't probably be really hard to find them. And that's probably part of the reason why all the surrounding nations were greatly afraid of them when they came in their areas. And then we get to chapter 14, and then we hear by Moses the names of these cities where there's to camp. And nobody knows where these cities are today. But what we do know, that anybody who was looking at their situation in the natural, this wouldn't make any sense at all, because this is not even on the way to Canaan. And so here they are, they're in the middle of the wilderness, and all the children of Israel, they all look bewildered, and that's exactly how God wants them to look. Because meanwhile, back in Egypt, sitting in the middle of a ruined economy, you have this Pharaoh, and he can't believe what he did, where he made this huge mistake in letting the Hebrews go. Because now, who's going to build their economy? He had just released Egypt's entire workforce. And so the logical thing for him to do is to go get them back. And now the Pharaoh can't think of any good reason not to go ahead and go get them back. But there were 10 really good reasons not for them to go get Israel back. And they're called the 10 plagues. But now he can't think of a one of them. And now he sees these children of Israel, they're all bewildered. And so he's looking at them like they're a bunch of lost sheep, just wandering around the wilderness. And so he's thinking, this is going to be really easy to round these people up. And God's allowing Pharaoh to believe this, because he's going to lead Pharaoh by God hardening Pharaoh's heart in his own greedy, wicked little heart as God sets his trap for him. Because even after all that the Pharaoh's gone through, the Pharaoh, he was never going to release Israel because Israel was too profitable to them. And so the only way to get Egypt to leave Israel alone was to destroy them, because Egypt would never stop pursuing them. So the only way to do this, for Israel to be able to become a nation under God, was to destroy Egypt, their leadership, and all their armies. Okay, so now Israel, they look like easy prey, and they're up against the Red Sea, and there's no place that they can run. And even all the other Egyptians back in Egypt, they can't seem to remember why they let Israel go. And you have to see here, it's only been about a week since they left. So it's been a week since the Egyptians were burying all of their dead. And so now Pharaoh, he saddles up their chariots, along with his posse of these 600 other choice chariots. And I had just watched a special on the 10 greatest weapons of the ancient world. And this is put out by the History Channel. The Egyptian chariot was one of these weapons. And it said that their chariots were far more superior than any of the other chariots in the area, because their chariots were very light and they were built for two people. So they would have one person just driving the chariot, and the other person could shoot arrows in any direction. And so in the ancient world, these were true killing machines. And so this would be like having like 600 tanks, the most modern military technology of that day. And then it also says here that they took all their other chariots. And so that would be the non-choice chariots. So these are probably like last year's model, or, a couple used chariots. But Joseph, the historian, he wrote, Pharaoh had commissioned over 50,000 horsemen, and that was along with 200,000 other infantry soldiers. So here you have 250,000 trained men with chariots, and they're all coming against only 600,000 untrained male slaves. with no weapons, who are only carrying tents and food and sitting around trying to protect their families. And now you got Israel here, and they're backed up against the Red Sea, and they can't run. And now they're taking their eyes off that pillar that's in front of them, and now they're looking behind them, and all they can see is the 600 chariots plus this insurmountable army of Egyptians, and there's no escape. Where the only way out was the way you came in, and they're blocking the only way out. And so now it says that they cry out to the Lord, which is a good thing. But here they have no confidence in God at all. So now we realize here, and because you kind of think about it, you go, well, why would God do this? But what it is these people in this situation are smack in the middle of the perfect will of God for their lives. And you can see that because God led them to this place, and he has led them there on purpose. And this happens in our lives all the time, where we find ourselves in difficult situations. We find ourselves in impossible situations, and we can wonder the same things, and we say, well, where are you, God? I really thought I was following you. This doesn't seem like your will, but you're in the perfect will of God. Because God's will isn't for you always having the most wonderful job or even the perfect marriage. It's not to have 2 dogs and a cat where you sit on the couch and you eat chocolate bonbons as you watch old movies on Netflix. But it's these difficult places are the places where God shows himself strong, and he leads us to them. God is always aware of exactly where you are. And these are those places where you really can learn how to trust God in your life. And without these trials, you'll never see God coming through for you. It's these types of situations where you get to know him really well. And these are the only places where you really learn to really trust him, because this is where he teaches us. And it's in these times where we learn that God, our God, he carries us through our lives. And so what we're to do is we're to keep our eyes on him. And if we keep our eyes on him, we will see God deliver us over and over again. And so even though Israel cries out to the Lord, they all turn on Moses. And we'll never see Moses. We'll never see this guy ever be able to catch a break from these people. And they're saying things like, hey, we told you to leave us alone. We were better off serving the Egyptians. What? Was there no graves in Egypt? But that's all there was for the Jews in Egypt was graves. The Egyptians didn't like the Jews. They were just going to work them till they died, and then they just bury them. And God, he had already shown himself strong to these people. He's already worked in their behalf. He's already delivered them from this bondage. And they saw all of those 10 plagues. But when things get difficult, and even for us, because we do the same things, we stop believing God and we start to complain. And when you stop believing God, and that's when you start to imagine all the worst case scenarios. And that's when you start reacting to your fears. And so now they're there and they're imagining that they and their children, that they're going to die. And so now they're in this fight or flight mode, but there's nowhere to flee to. And there's another lesson here for us to learn. If you ever know, or anybody ever told you, the Pharaoh, he always represents the devil in the Bible. And so right here, you see God has delivered these people, like just God has delivered us from the bondage of the devil. And he had this really great victory. Well, what you learn is that the devil's always going to come back again, and he's going to attack you. He's going to try to put you back in bondage. But these people, even after seeing God work, fear has a hold of them. And it's really easy here to understand that. And when there's fear in a crowd, it spreads. It's very, very contagious. But so is faith. And so what Moses does here is he says the very obvious. He says, don't be afraid. But I'm not really sure that he wasn't a little afraid. And then he tells him to quit moving around, and he tells him to stand still. And standing still is about the hardest thing to do when you have great fear, because you want to flee. or else you become paralyzed by your fear and you can't move. And then Moses, he says, see the salvation of the Lord. And when Moses is talking about salvation, he's talking about a physical salvation. He's not talking about salvation in a spiritual sense, like the way we use the word salvation. And then he says, and what he will accomplish for you today, and you will never see them again forever. The Lord will fight for you. And then Moses tells them to hold their peace. Now, I heard that a lot growing up. And really, to hold your peace is just basically the polite ways to tell somebody to shut up and to quit complaining. And the reason that I think Moses might be a little afraid is because of what God says next to him. And he says, well, why do you cry to me? So we see here that Moses is still crying, but he's acting really strong in front of these people. And then God tells Moses to tell the people to go forward. But when fear grips us and we're feeling trapped, it's really hard to move forward. And it's that paralysis that we're talking about. But we can't allow fear to stop us from moving forward. And the way you can deal with that is by not taking your eyes off the Lord. And then you make yourself go forward, even if it doesn't feel right. And it doesn't say it here, but I would get the feeling that that pillar was already over the Red Sea at that time. And Moses, he's not really sure what the Lord's going to do next, but he knows that the Lord is going to do something. Because you have to remember, Moses, he's never seen the movie and he's never read this chapter. And so God's basically telling Moses to quit crying and tell the children to go forward, and that all Moses has to do is to lift up his rod to part the Red Sea. And so what I believe God is saying here to Moses, he says, hey, I've heard your prayers. It's not time to pray anymore. Now it's time to move. Because there is a time to pray, but then there's a time to put your faith into action and to move forward and to act on what you've been praying about, especially when the Lord is leading. And here, God is literally leading with a pillar of fire. And it wasn't Moses who parted the Red Sea. It was God. All Moses had to do is just lift up his stick in faith. God does all the hard work. And that's how God does the miracles in our lives too. All we do is we just ask, and then we act in just simple obedience, and then we watch God do the miracles. And then we hear that the east wind blows and he folds the water back, and no one's ever seen anything like this before. And the only thing the children of Israel can do is go forward. The Lord here, he didn't really leave them any more options, because if he had left them any other option, they would have taken them. And they've never seen anything like this. And now the ground, it looks dry, but it would have still take tremendous faith. But I still think I wouldn't have wanted to be the one to go first. And then God tells Moses he's going to harden Pharaoh's heart so that Pharaoh will follow them into the sea. And then you just really kind of have to stop and think, what was Pharaoh thinking? And the reason God is doing this is the same reason for that reason of the 10 plagues, which is so the Egyptians will know that I am the Lord, which is that same exact question the Pharaoh had said to Moses when Moses met him for the very first time, where Pharaoh said, who is the Lord that I should obey his voice to let Israel go? So now all of Egypt is going to know who is the Lord. And then that pillar moves from in front of them to behind them, and he becomes a wall of protection to Israel. Where on the children of Israel's side, there's this fiery pillar that gives them light to travel on this dry ground. But on the Egyptian side, this same pillar is a pillar of darkness. It's a pillar of cloud. And we read in Psalm 77:16 that we're also told there that there's also this great storm that accompanied the parting of the sea. So there's also water being poured out on the Egyptians as they're walking through. So their side was all slick and muddy, And that storm went on all night long. And then the Apostle Paul, he also writes about the same event in his letter of the 1 Corinthians in chapter 10, verse 2, where he says that their fathers, and so what Paul is talking about, he's talking about these Jewish people that we're reading about here, that they all passed through the Red Sea. And he's saying, all were baptized in Moses in that cloud in the sea. And so for Israel, this is like the baptism in the life of a believer. Where way back at the Passover, Israel was redeemed from their slavery, and they were redeemed by the blood of a lamb. So, and that was that blood that was put on their doors. That is where Israel began its spiritual life, where they became the people of God as a nation. And so now this is Israel's first act of faith in their public proclamation of being God's people by this passing through the Red Sea, but they do it together, and they do it all as one nation. And this is the same for us as Christians, where we too are redeemed by God by the blood of a lamb, but then we're also commanded to, as one of our first acts of faith, to be baptized in water for what the Lord has already done for us by the delivering us by the shedding of his blood, by the lamb's blood. So here's Israel's baptism by going through the sea, where now they are being identified with Moses. So their relationship with God is being identified through the law. But we as Christians, as God's people of today, we're identified with Jesus Christ. And that's who we're identified with our baptism. All right, so now morning is approaching. And Israel, they've walked all night long with these walls of water on the right and their walls of water on the left. And I believe even with all this adversity, the Egyptians are starting to close in on them, because it says there that the Lord looked down through the pillar of fire and cloud, and he started taking off their chariot wheels. And I don't know why, but it's up to this point where the Egyptians have now decided to flee. And it's really incredible to me that it took them this long to figure out that the Lord was against them. And then the Lord told Moses to stretch out his hand over the sea, and then the water was brought back down on the Egyptians. And here again, that power that came down to move the sea, it didn't come out of Moses' hands, but the Lord is wanting to do this act through Moses. And the reason he's doing it is because he wants the people to honor Moses as his representative, because the people are learning who God is through Moses. And again, that's the same for us. God wants to use us for other people's lives. And it's never because he needs to or that he has to, but it's that we're going to represent him to other people, and it's for their sake, but it's also for ours. All right. So when we last left Moses and the children of Israel on the shore of the Red Sea, after that long night of walking on dry land in the midst of that sea, they're all safe from their enemies, and now they're only seeing the Egyptians' dead bodies scattered along the shoreline. And by God giving them such a great deliverance, it called for a song, because they had something to sing about now. And this is the first mention of any song in the Bible. And we've never heard of the children of Israel ever singing any song to the Lord back in Egypt or during their captivity as slaves. We've never even heard of the children of Israel ever worshiping the Lord in any way. And when they left Egypt, we don't hear them singing to the Lord, but we heard them complaining and asking Moses to take them back to Egypt. And that's all because Israel was immature in their faith. Israel had never chosen God. God chose them. And he's showing them who he is by his actions, by revealing himself to them. So in this new faith of theirs, this is not a blind faith. They didn't just make him up like how all the other false gods were just made up by men's imaginations. And God, he revealed to them, which is the same for us today as believers. And with most of us, we weren't really looking for God either, but God found us and he revealed himself to us. And it was maybe like through his word, or maybe it was through our circumstances where we too, like Israel, where we just didn't accept God, but we responded to God in his revealing of himself to us. And that's what happens to us when God has chosen to reveal himself to us. That's when we choose him. But you have to realize, in much of the same way, God had revealed himself to the Pharaoh and to Egypt. The only difference was they just weren't willing to choose him as God. And so now here in this song, Israel is responding to God as the whole nation who chooses him, because now he's revealed himself to them. And this song starts with, I will sing to the Lord. So here, the audience is just one. The audience is the Lord. And that's the same as when we sing here in the church. We're not just singing to each other like we're singing around the campfire, but here we're singing to an audience of one. We're singing to God himself, and we're singing for his pleasure. And it's kind of like when we sing happy birthday to somebody, where we'll try to do our best, but it doesn't have to be professional, but it does need to be sincere, and it needs to be out of love. And if you notice here in the song, there's not one word written about Moses or Aaron. It's all about God. The whole song is about God. And just like all great worship songs, they're saying nothing about themselves and what they've done and how they feel. The song's about God, and it's about what he's doing and what he's done. And the Lord is mentioned 10 times in this song. And like with all true worship songs, it gives witness to who God is and to what he's done for his people. And where it talks about God throwing the Egyptians and the horse and the rider into the sea, that was only fair. Because if you remember, the Pharaoh, he drowned all the baby boys. So God is just paying him back in the same way with all his troops, who weren't as innocent as all the little babies were. And even though we think of God as being a God of peace, and he is, but like this song says, he is also a man of war. And some people, they don't like to hear that, but it's true. So with God, it's not peace at any cost, but righteousness sometimes require God to go to war. And if you really look at it, it was the Egyptians who went to war against God, and so God just went to war against them. And just like Israel here, how they had an enemy, we have an enemy named Satan. And we see that God, he has other enemies. He has like sin and he has death. And so God, he's against his enemies. And so he wars against evil. And in this song, it doesn't say that the Lord gives me strength, but it says that the Lord is my strength. And that it also says that he is my salvation. So he doesn't just give them salvation, he is it.
You need to change your world. You need to let it go. Oh.
Thanks for listening to Change Your World. Change Your World is an outreach of Calvary Chapel, Waterford, and your neighborhood church. If you're listening to Change Your World in the Detroit metro area, why don't you join us for church this Sunday? Our service time is 10 a.m. at Calvary Chapel, Waterford, 183 South Winding Drive, Waterford, Michigan. We're competing with the Catholics. It's only an hour. All the donuts you can eat, and you don't have to believe a thing we say, but it could change your world.
You need to change your world.
The rest of today's message can be heard at yourneighborhoodchurch.org. So check us out and download the app. And until next week, remember,